Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. By the way, be sure to join us on Facebook at facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. Facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. A visiting scholar at the Henry Salvatori Center at Claremont McKenna College, William Voegeli is a contributing editor to the Claremont Review of Books. His own new book, Never Enough, America's Limitless Welfare State. Bill Voegeli, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let me begin by quoting to you from Never Enough. There is no prospect that America's welfare state will become either a multiple or a fraction of what it is now.
Yes.
Why not?
There's a saying in politics that you either have big fights or you have nasty fights. I think in America we're not really having a big fight over the welfare state because most conservatives don't say but realize that it's not going to disappear. Most liberals don't say but realize it's not going to become like the Swedish social safety net. So the goalposts are fairly close together. But we have what we wind up with is a kind of narcissism of small differences. The relatively small amount of terrain between the absolute conservative and the absolute liberal position is fought over tenaciously.
All right. Segment one, by the numbers, how big was the welfare state before Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in easy to grasp for the layman terms, and how big is it today?
Yeah, it was. America's welfare state was negligible prior to 1933, and it was not really that big even at the start of World War II. The good data coming from the Office of Management and Budget's historical tables unfortunately begins in 1940. And the press of financing First World War II and then the Korean War were such that it wasn't until 1954 that per capita constant dollar expenditures on human resources, this is the OMB's term, which means roughly what we mean by the welfare state, wasn't until 54 that they equaled the level they had been at in 1940. So you can really sort of start talking about the welfare state in the mid-50s. And you ask, how big is it today? Well, according to the historical tables going up through 2009, constant dollar per capita expenditures by the federal government on these five big areas: Social Security, all other federal programs for income support, Medicare, all other federal programs for health, such as Medicaid, health sciences, and all federal programs for education, job training, and social services. Those were 18.6 times as big in 2009 as they had been in 1954. So it's doubling every, I think, 18 years or so, something like that.
All right. Bill, draw a distinction. You've already started to do so, but draw a distinction in terms of size, magnitude, between the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt,
right,
and about 3 decades later, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society.
The New Deal laid down markers, established political precedents, but I don't think it spent a great deal of money compared to the American experience prior to FDR's election in 1932. Compared to our baseline understanding of what the government does today, the New Deal operationally looks fairly modest, but the foundations for the building were laid then. The Social Security Act of 1935 established the basis for really the welfare state that has been built up since. Even Medicare is not legally a separate title, a separate piece of legislation, but an amendment to the 1935 Social Security Act. So what
happens? What happens with the Great Society?
The Great Society is when it's really from Johnson winning his election in '64 until about the mid-'70s, until, strangely enough, till Carter takes over, that there's this big surge of federal spending. Both under Johnson and then under Nixon and Ford, per capita constant dollar federal spending on human resources grows annually around 10% a year, give or take.
Staggering.
Yeah, and then partly because of political circumstances. You have Prop 13 and the tax revolt in 1978.
In California, the proposition which limited property taxes here in California and led to a wider tax revolt in the country.
That's right. So you have the, to borrow Peter Orszag's phrase, the growth curve bends a lot then. The welfare state grows, it continues to grow after this mid-60s to mid-70s surge, but at a much slower rate. Even under Jimmy Carter, the growth rate is more like 2 or 3% a year.
All right.
Much lower under Reagan.
What happens to defense spending as the welfare state grows?
It shrinks.
It shrinks in real terms or relative terms?
It shrinks in relative terms.
So to wrap up your description of the growth of the welfare state, simply describing it, not the rights or the wrongs, but to describe it, it is accurate to say that there are still old people alive in this country who were born into a nation in which the welfare state simply didn't exist. There are a lot of people, middle-aged in this country, who were born into a nation in which welfare spending was relatively modest and the principal spending effort by the federal government was defense.
Correct.
And then there are lots and lots and lots of people in their 30s or younger who, excuse me, I don't mean to say 30, but middle-aged people who have experienced this enormous expansion in spending, who have experienced the growth of the welfare state to be triple that of defense spending. But I'd almost suggest that it's happened so quickly that most Americans are only very dimly aware of it.
Yes, 2011, anyone under 45 years of age today, anyone born since 1965, has no real recollection of a country organized differently than the one we live in now.
Segment 2, what the liberals have wrought. From Never Enough. Progressives and New Dealers supplanted a government kept on a short leash to protect liberty with a government able to lay claim to all the powers it needs to promote welfare, close quote. What you're getting at here, we just got at the growth of the welfare state. What you're getting at here is the intellectual groundwork that got laid during the period of the New Deal.
Right.
Explain how that happened. Right up until the New Deal, it is understood in the courts, in the academy, elsewhere, that the federal government is to be tightly limited, and then something happens. Yes.
Well, the Depression happens, of course, which creates a political opening that had not been there before. That's at sort of the ground level of actual political events.
Right.
Up in the air, at the level of political ideas, the progressive revolution of the late 19th and early 20th century had really set itself against the American founding, against the idea of limited constitutional government, and said that this was, for instance, Woodrow Wilson's position. We need a government that instead of being closed in by checks and balances and the separation of powers. We need a government that's energetic, that has the power it needs, that can do all the things, a nation much different from the one that Madison wrote the Constitution in, and the agricultural nation with a ribbon of people along the Atlantic seaboard in the late 18th century.
We're a big, powerful, vigorous industrial nation, and we need a big, powerful, vigorous federal government.
John Rockefeller's America is very different from Thomas Jefferson's. This was the theory. And a number of things, a number of steps towards the world we live in now were made during those years, but there was a curtailing factor, which was that Americans remained dubious about this idea of pushing back against the American founding. They still liked the notion of a limited state of Jeffersonianism of government that was under our control. I think a very astute thing that Franklin Roosevelt did was to reformulate the progressive endeavor in Jeffersonian terms. Instead of saying that we are getting away from Madison's Constitution, he constantly framed the New Deal project as an endeavor to update the concept of inalienable rights to the circumstances of the 20th century. So there were going to be rights to certain social welfare benefits, and the government's job was to guarantee and secure those rights.
The right to a job, the right to health care, and so
Decent
forth.
health care, good schooling, decent housing.
So we get the intellectual foundations laid first by the progressives, then adapted by that crafty politician Franklin Roosevelt.
A virtuoso.
The virtuoso, exactly. And now let me quote to you, once again, which brings us to the intellectual state of affairs today. And I'll quote to you once again from Never Enough. And this, I think, is one of the most arresting quotations in the entire book. Quote, "What would be the size and nature of a welfare state that was not contemptibly austere, that did not urgently need a larger budget and a broader agenda?" Close quote. In other words, if you could give the liberals everything they wanted, what would the welfare state look like? To continue the quotation, the answer to this question is, well, that there is no answer to this question. Explain that, Bill.
I started working on the book with what the lawyers call a good faith effort to...
Silly you.
Well...
Go ahead.
The premise was this. For 75 years, since the start of the New Deal, at least, American liberals have been saying that the welfare state we actually have is woefully and criminally insufficient, that it doesn't spend what it needs, have the resources, do what a just, decent nation ought to. So my premise was that if there are these constant complaints about the welfare state's insufficiency, there must be, if you sort of follow the arc of that logic, a perfectly sufficient welfare state out there, kind of a platonic ideal,
right,
that, as you were just saying, has the money it needs, the programs, does what it needs, and doesn't need one more thing to be better. The point was, well, what is that? What does that welfare state look like? And the conclusion was that that city in speech really doesn't exist. There's no operative ideal for what a final, complete, and perfectly sufficient welfare state ought to be. This, I think, is the most interesting and troubling feature, I would say, about the liberal intellectual and political project.
So let me ask you if this is a fair summary of the liberal welfare state project of the last 8 decades. They overturned a well-articulated, I would say beautifully articulated, founding ideal of limited government, which finds its highest expression in the Constitution of the United States, but which you can see in the early colonial constitutions and early state constitutions, deeply ingrained in the American political thought and habit. Right. They overturned this well-articulated ideal of limited government in favor of a new ideal, the welfare state, which is, when it comes right down to it, fundamentally incoherent.
I can't disagree. Yes, I think...
Make the best argument for them that you can.
Well,
How about if I put it that way?
Yes. I mean, all right, devil's advocate, I think their best argument is that the Depression was the most vivid example of American capitalism not being a benign and secure and reassuring system. It needed adjustment. And that the liberal project, though never quite clear as to what it was ultimately aiming for, understood that it wanted to modify, soften, civilize, stabilize American capitalism. And I think if you could bring in the editorial staff of the New Republic, for example, they would say, you know, if you look at the whole track record over the past 78 years since FDR was elected, the liberal project hasn't gone off perfectly, but Americans have certain securities from unemployment, from poverty that they lacked before, that the incursions on civil liberties and the rights of people have not been zero, but they haven't been terrible either, and most people think the trade-off has been worth it. I think this would be sort of the liberal argument.
Segment 3, picking up the tab. Never enough. The programs, yes, need to be paid for, but very, very rich people and giant corporations will pick up the tab. And by blackening the skies with crisscrossing dollars, the welfare state manages people's perceptions of its costs and benefits to encourage them to believe an impossibility that every household can be a net importer of wealth. Close quote. Explain that.
Yeah, I'd be a bigger fan of liberalism if they'd be more honest on this point. If they would say, look, the programs we want to carry out here to help the poor, the suffering, the people who are sick, these are expensive undertakings. Living in a society that has these kinds of protections will make all of us better off. Those of us who find ourselves needing to avail ourselves of one or more of these programs clearly will be better off, but the rest of us will have the sense of security and social solidarity and psychic satisfaction of living in a society that's takes care of its vulnerable better. Therefore, my
the ideal liberal.
The ideal liberal says, therefore, we should all pitch in and help, and we don't have to turn the IRS into our favorite government agency, but we should understand that these are the burdens we pay in order to make our society a better place to live. If I heard that, I would, I'd have hard questions about what the limits of the enterprise would be, how it would be funded, how it would work. But I would have a great deal of respect for the people who put that argument
forward. For the
forward.
fundamental honesty of the
That's
argument.
right.
Okay. Let me quote to you again from Never Enough.
Yeah.
Quote, confining tax increases to the most prosperous 2% of the population in order to award valuable prizes to the other 98% will result in making 49 people happy for every one you make angry, which seems like a good formula for winning an election.
Yes.
Close quote.
Yes, the gap between this ideal liberal and the actual was shown in the 2008 campaign when both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, competing for the Democratic nomination and then later the general election, promised repeatedly and categorically that if elected, no federal tax on any family making less than $250,000 a year or any individual making less than $200,000 a year would increase. Not income taxes, not any other...
Nothing.
Not nothing. Well, you do that, you come into office, as Barack Obama did, saying there's this long list of wonderful things we want the government to do, and all of the money increments are going to come about by raising taxes on the 2 or 3% of the population making more than $250,000 a year. I don't think it works numerically. I just don't think there's enough money in those precincts for that to work out. But even if it did, I don't think it works sort of philosophically. You read the the liberal blogger Matthew Iglesias. You read him. Yeah. Well, he had a very interesting reaction to this $250,000 limit put forward by Obama, which was the bad thing with that proposal from the liberal point of view is that it concedes the core conservative argument, which is that the welfare state is not worth having. It's worth having only if somebody else pays for it.
Bill, here's what I'm probing for, I guess. That the welfare state is almost necessarily, I haven't thought it through, maybe it is necessarily, but for sure almost necessarily insidious. And here's why. Because it creates almost irresistible incentives for the government and those who support the expansion of the welfare state to be fundamentally dishonest with the American people. So Franklin Roosevelt, what did you call him, the virtuoso, the political virtuoso, says, here's how we'll handle Social Security. We won't just make it a program for poor people, we'll make it a program for everybody, making everybody feel bought in, so to speak.
That's right.
And will create the impression that you're putting money away for your own retirement. Fundamentally untrue. That is just not the way the system works, and yet that's what most Americans appear to have believed for most of the period that program has been in existence. Item one. Item two, it creates incentives for politicians to buy voters off, not to represent them fairly, but to engage in a kind of class warfare, trying to force costs out of their district and bring benefits into their district, trying to force costs off the great mass of voters and onto the small number of wealthier voters, and to be fundamentally dishonest about it. Just as you said, blackening the skies with crisscrossing dollars, the welfare state manages people's perceptions. The government of the United States ought not to be in the position of managing citizens' perceptions. It is outrageous from the get-go.
That phrase, blackening the sky, comes from William Buckley's book, Up from Liberalism. So it's 50 years old. And it was sort of a throwaway line of his. He could do these sorts of things.
Bill had enough to throw away.
Yeah, that's right. I had to bear down on it. But I think it really does get at something that's essential to the American welfare state and the liberal project, which is that there is, as you say, a concerted effort to make people believe that everybody can come out ahead if a finite number of dollars is rearranged kind of furiously.
It's nonsense.
Yeah.
Final quotation in this segment 3 here, when we're talking about the cost. Never enough. Quote, "The only remaining constraint on the growth of the welfare state is the problem of paying for it," close quote. So as a matter of political fact, you think we're stuck with it and the welfare state will grow whenever the economy grows. Whenever there's more money, it'll get spent on the welfare state.
This has been the pattern not only in the U.S. but in European social welfare states too. The slice of the pie allocated to the welfare state grows even as the pie itself gets bigger. So it's growing sort of doubly. It's a larger percentage of a larger total economy. The world has never really seen a shrinking welfare state.
Segment 4, the conservative failure. Never enough. This is the saddest line in Never Enough. Quote, "Adjusted for inflation, per capita federal welfare state spending," I can hardly believe this, "was 77% higher in 2007 than it was when President Reagan took office," close quote. How can that be? The Reagan Revolution takes place. Some years later, you get the Gingrich Revolution taking place. George H.W. Bush succeeds Ronald Reagan. George W. Bush is in office for 8 years. A lot of conservatives have a lot of prominence in American politics throughout this period, and yet per capita federal welfare state spending goes up 77%.
That's right. I mean, to put it another way, this is a period in American history where Republicans were always in control of something, unlike the New Deal, unlike the first 2 years of the Obama administration, either the White House or they had a base on Capitol Hill. Well, a lot of these programs are on autopilot. Social Security. Congress didn't need to do anything for those to grow. Medicare, just sort of leave them be. And other programs, I was on a panel recently with Robert Rector of the Heritage Foundation, who was looking at, he has a careful report of 71 means-tested federal welfare programs.
Means-tested means you only get the benefit if you're poor.
That's
basically.
right.
If you need it.
That's right.
By somebody's standard, you need it.
So these are not the middle-class entitlements.
As opposed to Social Security, which you get, millionaires get Social
Warren
Security.
Buffett gets a Social Security check. That's right. And he said, he had a chart showing the growth of these, and it's just shoots up like this. There's this brief plateau that looked like about 45 minutes when Reagan is first in office, and then it takes right off again. So even there's a huge dynamic at work here, and I think conservatives in 1980 and again in 1994 really underestimated how formidable this was going to be to stop a reverse.
Okay, never enough again. The growth of the welfare state is the result of two trends: economic growth and the political willingness to devote an increasing portion of the economic output to social welfare programs. You've made this point earlier.
Yeah.
During the 2 decades following Reagan's 1980 election, economic growth accounted for almost all the increase in welfare state spending. The portion of GDP devoted to federal welfare outlays barely budged, close quote. So, we can at least say that Ronald Reagan capped the political willingness to devote more and more of the pie to welfare spending. Yeah. As the pie got bigger, fine, welfare spending got bigger, but he at least limited that. That's an achievement.
That's an achievement. The on this question of economic growth, which both parties are for, and conservatives think they do better than liberals. To change the metaphor a bit from slices of pies, the conservative dilemma is that you're on an escalator, and it's going up, and you're trying to walk down. The economy is getting bigger, even if you do these exertions to constrain the relative size of the welfare state. It's getting bigger just by virtue of economic expansion.
Mm. What happened during Newt Gingrich, and then what happened under George W. Bush?
Yeah.
When I say during Newt Gingrich, Newt Gingrich is speaker from actually takes office in 95, is speaker for 4 years. 4 years.
Yeah.
So the second half of the 90s.
Right. The president under whom welfare state spending grew most slowly was Ronald Reagan. Second is Bill Clinton. So Gingrich's efforts were not in vain here. Mm-hmm. This clearly has something to do with that. But there were also...
Gridlock works.
Gridlock helped. There were also some demographic factors slowing down the growth of the welfare state in the 1990s. The people signing up for Social Security and Medicare when Bill Clinton was president that was the age cohort born during the Great Depression, a very small group of Americans. So just the demographic bulge was negligible during those years. So
conservatives got demographically lucky for a while.
Yeah. Now, our luck has run out, of course.
And George W. Bush is president. Tom DeLay is the moving force among Republicans in the House of Representatives. Yeah. Speaker Dennis Hastert, a Republican. What happens then?
Yes, well, I think Republicans were burned so badly by the government shutdown in late 1995 and early 1996 that they never wanted to get near that again. So you had probably the most demoralizing thing conservatives have ever heard from a Republican politician was when Tom DeLay, towards, I think this was about midway through Bush's presidency, said, there's really not much left to cut in the federal budget. The reason we're not cutting back more is that, we've been at it a while and all of the fat's pretty much excised.
So conservatives, the welfare state has been with us for 7.5 decades. Conservatives have been against it with varying degrees of intensity for 7.5 decades. They have succeeded by some measures in retarding the growth of the welfare state, but never, not once, not for a single year, in shrinking it. Quote, liberal victories advance liberalism. Conservative victories postpone liberalism. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, my esoteric explanation for this phenomenon is that people like getting things. And the party that presents itself as the party of giving things to people has a significant built-in advantage.
So the electorate has been corrupted. The Republic of Virtue. Washington talks about the importance of virtue among the citizenry. Yeah. All the founding fathers did. And now Americans are on the take.
That's maybe not the... not words I would necessarily choose, but also not ones I could disagree with. I think that you're talking about sort of the marketing of the New Deal and the Social Security, talking about the efforts to reassure people that the money they would be getting was their money they had put in. This was not only to serve the purpose of building an appetite for ever larger Social Security payments and benefits, but it was also to reassure people on just exactly that point. If you're getting a Social Security check, no, you're not on the dole. You're not a loafer. You're not taking advantage of your fellow citizens. This is your money that you're getting back. So there were great exertions to reassure people at that point in American history when they were still very dubious about the propriety of the welfare state.
To reassure them by misleading them.
That this was a legitimate undertaking, yes.
All right. Segment 5, what is to be done? Never enough. Quote, conservatives need to take the position that America is going to have a welfare state, should have a welfare state, and that it's not part of the conservative project to bring about the disappearance of the welfare state, even in the distant future. Bill, I want to be your friend. I really do. You have to explain that to me.
Yes. Well, our mutual friend, Ramesh Ponnuru,
Yes.
wrote basically a very nice review of Never Enough for National Review. But he
That
said,
makes two of you. Go ahead.
but he said he sort of pushed back on this point as well. He said Voegeli was, I don't remember it exactly, but something along the lines of, Voegeli is oddly emphatic on when he insists that the conservatives need to sort of reconcile themselves to the existence and sort of perpetuity of the welfare state. Well, I think that this might strike you as a strange analogy, but how these questions get framed is very important in politics. And the analogy I have in mind is the tensions between the Israelis and the Palestinians. If two adjacent people have, as countries have been having for thousands of years, these sort of boundary disputes. Mm-hmm. Well, you can have a kind of a normal discussion once fighting doesn't really seem like it's going to settle things anymore, and say, all right, we'll draw the line here rather than here, and you can split the difference and work these things out. If, however, the main reason Israel is deeply reluctant about these kinds of concessions is that it is those land for peace swaps become very dubious if there's never going to be any peace. If you're dealing with people who want to abolish the entity you're defending.
So you're saying that even as the Palestinians must grant formally and forever the legitimacy of the Israelis, of the state of Israel, conservatives need to grant the legitimacy of the welfare state. Get over it.
Short answer, yes.
All right.
Get over it. And also,
But, okay, so fine. I understand that as a matter of if this thing has been with us for 75 years, it's not going away tomorrow, and no conservative is going to be able to win elections without dealing with that large, or at least not be able to govern without dealing with that fact. Got it. I'm with you there. I understand that completely. I'm with you everywhere. You're such a charmer, and you have so many facts at your disposal. But the argument that I'm not,
I hear a tough question.
Well, no. I just repeat to you. It's one thing to say conservatives need to take the position that America is going to have a welfare state. Got it. Understood. Should have a welfare state is a different argument.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. While those progressives were writing their books back in 100 years ago, attacking the founding, there was sort of a counter-progressive movement that I think needs to be explored. I'm thinking of people like Charles Evans Hughes, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court twice, Calvin Coolidge, William Howard Taft, the only person to be both President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Elihu Root, an important figure, no longer very famous, and what it seems to me these gentlemen were doing was trying to fashion a way for government to have the energy it needed to cope with what were indeed important economic and social transformations. America really was, in many ways, a very different place in 1920 than it was in 1787.
Well, I don't know anything about Root, and I don't know much about Charles Evans Hughes, but certainly Coolidge and Taft were imbued with the ethic of the founders.
That's right.
Limited government, civic virtue, a republic of virtue. So how did they...
But at the same time, as I understand it, and I'm working into this, at the same time
I hope you're under contract for the next book, because this sounds fascinating.
I think conservatives need to... among the things we need to conserve is this sort of effort to adapt the constitutional framework to the requirements of a modern industrial, or now what they're calling a post-industrial society. The Jeffersonian agrarianism provides just a finite inventory of answers to these problems.
Right.
And my impression is that these critics of progressivism were wrestling with the question, how do we fashion a state that is in simultaneous conformity with the founding principles and with the modern exigencies. It's going to be it can't simply mean that any government endeavor that Thomas Jefferson would not have recognized is therefore illegitimate.
Final couple of questions here. A couple of weeks ago, we had President Obama's State of the Union address, followed by Congressman Paul Ryan's response. Let me just read you a passage from each and ask you to comment. Open-ended. You comment in any way you'd like, but fairly briefly, alas, because of time constraints here.
Understood.
President Obama, quote, "I will not hesitate to create or enforce common sense safeguards to protect the American people. That's what we've done in this country for more than a century. It's why we passed reform that finally prevents the health insurance industry from exploiting patients." Close quote. Health reform to protect Americans, common sense safeguards. What do you make of all that?
Well, I think that
The moment has passed? Sounds a little old-fashioned?
no, I think that the contradictions of our healthcare system were not resolved, but in a way accentuated by the Healthcare Reform Act passed in 2010. And so I think that our healthcare system is still a house divided against itself that cannot stand. It's partly centralized command and control, partly market-based.
He's creating a crisis, not ending one.
I think he's... Every question that's been put off has been put off in a way that it is hoped will make Medicare for all or a public option the inevitable response 5, 10, or 15 years from now.
Congressman Ryan, their actions, the Democrats, show they want a federal government that controls too much and spends too much. This is a future in which we will transform our social safety net into a hammock which lulls able-bodied people into lives of complacency and dependency. We need to reclaim our American system of limited government, which has blessed us with unprecedented prosperity and has done more to help the poor than any other economic system ever designed, close quote. He's driving Republicans right over the cliff. Is that right?
No.
He's resisting the welfare state to which Americans have grown accustomed?
That's not how I hear it.
Good. All right. Let's hear it.
I hear it that Congressman Ryan would agree with the point I've been making that we need, that there's no prospect we're going to eliminate the welfare state. We need a welfare state we can live with, one even that we can admire.
And a social safety net.
A social safety net, one that helps people who genuinely need it and gets out of the way of letting people help themselves in other circumstances. There are going to be people who are, there's a small number of people who are chronically in bad shape in terms of their life situation. There's a larger number who are transitionally. A decent society will find a way to help them, and some of the ways will involve government programs, but not limitless.
All right. William Voegeli, author of Never Enough, America's Limitless Welfare State. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.